Hello everyone, today I will be showcasing in this tutorial how you can make a 3D model in Blender of an ice cream like the one that you're seeing on screen right now. This tutorial is oriented for beginners, so it will not be making use of very complex features of this program. We will delve into the process of modeling this ice cream, making the whole geometry for the mesh of the cone and the ice cream itself, and we will also delve into how to create a set of very simple materials that can be used to make your ice cream look somewhat realistic. We'll also be covering how to use compute shaders with your GPU to increase the speed at which you will be able to render your final image. The first step that we must take to embark in this process of creating the ice cream is to make a cone of sorts. To be able to model the cone of our ice cream, we will be using a cylinder shape. Now, there are many different kinds of ice cream cones that you can have in your ice cream, but in the case of this tutorial I will be showing this kind of ice cream cone that has a flat base. So you will be using a cylinder which, since we are going to be using a subdivision modifier for our final render, does not need to be too high poly, but it doesn't have to be too low poly either, so we'll be sticking to the default 32 vertices, for example. That is a good enough value for us. So to get started with our scene, we're going to be deleting everything that is in it by pressing the A key to select everything, and then the X key to delete, and erasing absolutely everything from existence. Now, to create our new cylinder that we are going to be using, we're going to use Shift A and go to the Mesh menu and add a cylinder. Now, as I mentioned before, the cylinder that I'm going to be using is going to be a one with 32 vertices by default. When we first apply the subdivision modifier to our cylinder, you will begin to notice that there is a weird kind of deformation in the poles at the top and the bottom of our cylinder. Now, this is because of the fact that the cap shapes that we are using for this cylinder are currently fully flat individual surface. So once it gets subdivided, it performs a real weird subdivision operation where we will get exactly what we are asking for, but that is not what we want. So the solution for this is to add some edge loops around, which will serve as support edges, and then delete the center of our flat caps for our cylinder, and use it using a grid fill modifier, which will allow us to fill this with a quad topology. Now, once we have a quad topology, the subdivision modifier will work properly and it won't have any problems anymore. And with these changes, we're now ready to begin creating the shape of our ice cream cone. After we have finished by capping our cylinder with some quad topology, we can begin adding the reference image of our choosing by simply downloading an image and dragging it into the viewport of Blender, and it will be automatically added as a plane. From that point onwards, we could simply begin deforming the geometry of our cylinder, which in truth is a very simple object. We are going to be performing real simple operations with a real simple low poly object, and the subdivision modifier is going to be doing most of the job for us when it comes to generating the good looking geometry. We're simply in charge of giving it a current sense of what the direction in which it must go is, and add all of the required supporting geometry. So currently we're going to be modeling all of the details that we want to have in our ice cream, and as you can see, we've already performed the capping at the bottom of the cylinder, but in my case I did not perform the capping yet at the top. Don't worry, I will do it now. So what I'm doing right now is adding all of the geometry to hollow out enough of my ice cream, which, depending on what your purposes are, you might want to hollow out more or less of your ice cream. In my case, I simply want to make a simple render, so I do not have to hollow out much of this geometry. So if you want to make, for example, an ice cream that will be destructible, or for whatever purposes you want, you might want to make your geometry completely different, but this is just a showcase of how I did it for a real simple render. And now I will be performing the same operation we did on the other cap to add quad topology to this cap of the cylinder, so that we can apply the subdivision modifier without having any sort of deformities on our ice cream. Now from this point onwards, all that we have left for this piece of geometry is simply to finish touching up the final details. So right now I'm going to remove all the excessive modifiers, because in the end we only really need one single subdivision modifier, and I'm going to be adding the remaining loop cuts required to generate the shape that I desire for my ice cream, before moving on to creating the grid that you can see on the cone, because that is going to be a completely different shape that we are going to be making from scratch. So now the thing that we want to do is make this little piece of decoration right here. The best way of doing this that I can come up with right now is by making a cylinder which has about 16 spots, because on this side it looks like there's 7 or 8 vertical lines. We do have right now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and probably under here 6, horizontal lines. So what we're going to be making is this cylinder right here that has, since in this face looks like there's 8 on this side, well, I will be making a 16 vertex cylinder, which isn't exactly what we got in the drawing, but this is the best we can do with this terrible reference that I got right here. You sometimes have to eyeball the things, and the vertical cuts, we're going to be making them as good as you can get, not necessarily perfect, but if we do bring this to the center again and we move our cylinder to have sort of the shape that it's meant to have here, we can then make visually the number of cuts that look to be somewhat correct, and this looks like a pretty good approximation. So now that we're right here, what we can do is apply activate, not apply yet, a skin modifier, which will look terrible at first. You're like, what is this thing right here? But don't worry, this is because the skin modifier is currently looking real weird. It's going pretty thick all over the line geometry, so we are going to use Ctrl A to make this smaller, and now we got a pretty good looking grid all around the shape here. And with this shape right here, we can just mark this as smooth shading, activate the subdivision surface modifier. So I think this looks good enough for now for the purpose of this tutorial. And we have to see that we got this weird bulging shape right here. Okay, so just in case I make a mistake, I'm going to be duplicating my cone. I'm going to be saving it, and let's work on the new one. And right here, I'm going to be adding another little, or well, we can be doing it here. We're going to be Ctrl B, remove the shifty thing, Ctrl B, bring this down without proportional editing, sorry, bring this down and extrude outwards. And now is when we can get started with proportional editing to make this shape be closer to what the image is showcasing. You can even add an extra cut in the middle if you want to make this more rounded. And out of here we already got a pretty decent shape for the cone. You can even, try to move things around a bit if you want to better the shape, but I think this is good enough for now. We're gonna bring back this other cylinder and activate the modifiers that we were using, and now we can properly try to align this to what we have in the picture. Now you might be asking yourself, how are we going to be attaching this shape right here to the surface of our cone, because it is now no longer a simple cylinder, so we cannot make such easy deformations, and there are multiple options. We could always resort to using a lattice, or we could use proportional editing to more or less eyeball it till it's more or less okay. But the way that you can do this most effectively is by going over and look for a shrink wrap modifier, which I am looking for in this menu right now. There it is, shrink wrap, and we're going to drag the shrink wrap to the top of the stack. And if you apply shrink wrap, what it's going to do is move all of the vertices of an object to the surface of another object, which for us this could be a problem if we were shrink wrapping a certain object around another, because all of the vertices means that we lose the volume. But since technically our object is completely flat, we do not lose any detail, because all of the skin operations and subdivision operations are performed after we do the shrink wrap modifier, which is why it's important that we put this one at the top of the stack of modifiers. So we'll be clicking on this ice cream cone right here, and as you can see, it's now following its shape. And if we activate the modifiers, you can see that it is now nicely packing in right around the cylinder. And even if we make any new deformations around here, the shrink wrap modifier will follow it just fine, as long as there is enough geometry for it to do it. And there we go, we got our cone right here. Now that we got our cone ready, we can get started on going to the next step, which is making the shape of the ice cream. So to make the shape of the ice cream, we're now going to have to make a sort of a spiral shape, which will be used to follow the shape of the ice cream that we saw in that picture. But to be able to do that, we're gonna have to enable two very important add-ons that come by default with Blender, which, if we go into edit preferences, we can look for extra, and both of these add-ons we're going to require, which is extra objects and extra objects for curves and extra objects for meshes. Both of these we're going to be using now in this tutorial in a while, so you have to make sure that you enable both of them, and then you're ready to go. So with extra curves, we can go ahead and look for a curve and find a curved spiral right here, which we're going to be choosing of the type, the Archimedean one. The Archimedean spiral is the one that is going to be most closest to unmodified ellipse to get a real simple spiral that will help us generate the ice cream shape. So we're going to be making a radius of 1, for example, and we can keep the radius growth at 0 for now, and let's make the height smaller. So for our purposes, it would be interesting to have the cursor around the point where we want to locate the ice cream, right? So for this, what you can do is go ahead and put the location of the cursor to be centered on 0 and increase the height a few units. For example, about 4 would be good enough. So now that we got the cursor right where we require it, this is for simplicity's sake, to make it easier to visualize and work with, we're gonna add our spiral, and we can make this spiral go however we want. We can customize if it's clockwise or counterclockwise, but for our purposes this doesn't really matter much. What matters is that this spiral is 3D, and it will have a radius that adjusts to that of the outer radius of the lowest part of the ice cream. We will be more or less eyeballing it. You can modify these things later through scaling, not exactly, and we will be lowering the height to fit that of our ice cream, more or less something like that. Now the amount of turns does not need to be such a big amount. We're gonna be decreasing that to about probably 10 turns, and then we can increase our height and it would look a little bit more natural, right? We could even decrease the turns to a smaller number. Something like 5 would be reasonable, maybe a little bit more, but let's keep it at 5 for now. And the radius growth is going to be a parameter that determines how much the radius starts growing from the bottom. If we put a negative value for the radius growth, though, we get exactly the shape that we want. Though this shape is perfect right now, it's pristine, it's completely straight, and it is unrealistic. A real ice cream would never be shaped like this, but we will be modifying this later by hand. Now this is a perfect shape to begin our ice cream. You can customize these parameters however you want. We will be working with these values because I think they are going to give me pretty good results. Now that we got this curve right here completed, we can go out of here as it is already generated. We can get rid of the image, and you can see that this is completely empty. It doesn't have anything in there. And we want to add the shape of the ice cream. If we go back to look at the image, you can see that it looks like this ice cream has somewhat of a star shape. So usually machines that are used, or the things that are used to pour the ice cream, have a nozzle with a certain shape, and this nozzle gives this kind of decorative shape to the ice cream output, right? In this case, it looks like it's probably a 6 or an 8-point star. So I will be generating a star that fits my needs. So for that, we will be going to Mesh, Extras, and pick the simple star. And you can select whatever number of points you want. And I believe an 8-point star might look good. So now that we got this star mesh right here, what we can do is get rid of the complete top half of this mesh and the center. And now we only have this shape right here, which we can bring to the center of this object that it's part of. Now that we've got this thing right here, we can press space and say convert to curve. And this thing right here should look somewhat like that, all of these looking orange or yellow, and one of them being empty color. This means that this object right here is now a curve rather than a mesh. And why do we make this a curve? Well, because we can go to the spiral, which is another kind of curve, and we can go ahead and go to the spiral properties and assign this as the mesh that we can use to decorate this other spiral. So we will be generating a shape out of this one, of the star shape, throughout the whole curve. So how are we going to be doing this? This is now something that you can do in different ways. You could make a simple star mesh segment and make it follow, but I'm going to be using this method because I think it's easier to work with in this case. So we select the taper object to be the star that we had. We're going to be saying that the bevel is going to be the object. We're going to select this object right here, and now we got our star shape thing right here. Now this looks kind of weird, you might have noticed, and you would be correct. Now how do we fix this? Well, one of the first things that we would want to do is fill in the caps, of course. Now the next step would be figuring out how to actually get this ice cream shape to, well, not suck, because you can clearly see that there is a big problem right here. This shape is not completely adjusting to our spiral as we want it to. Oops. So the way to do this, you know, we want to be scaling this, but as you can see, if we try to scale, we cannot. So one thing we can do is go ahead and change the taper radius to odd. And now it starts to look a little bit better, but not yet the way we want it to. There's still plenty of artifacts and weird looking artifacts going on. So at least the good thing now is that if we press Alt S, we can start to scale our taper exactly as we want it to. It doesn't work with regular scaling, but the good news is that we can use proportional editing to completely change the way our taper is going to be wherever we want it to be scaled. So one of the things that we can do now, for example, is make a really simple transition into a point on the end, on both ends. But before we continue, you have to realize that this shape right here that we're using is currently a real simple shape which has real sharp angles, and it is being shaded smooth. So with smooth shading activated, the normals have to interpolate between all the vertices, and this means that all of this is as if it was a single face normal wise, and it looks real weird. It has real terrible normals going on. So the way we could alleviate this is by adding a subdivision modifier, which will make our shape both look better and have enough geometry to generate decent normals that are not trash. So you can increase the amount of subdivisions however you want, which is important when you're working for a render. When you're rendering, you must have enough geometry, but when you are going to be baking, if you're going to be exporting this to a game engine, you would want to optimize your geometry. But if you're going to be rendering, which is what we're going to be doing in this tutorial, then having enough geometry is what we care about. So now we can start seeing a shape that is closer to what I showed at the beginning of this video. What we can do is start modifying this cone in such way that, well, sorry, not the cone, but the ice cream shape itself, so that it fits in here. It hides all of the ugly details. We can close it up like that. We can make it look as juicy as you want. You can do basically anything to customize your ice cream to be as cool as you want it to be. Now obviously there are some things that you will have to touch for a long amount of time to be able to get down perfectly, but for the purposes of this video, this amount of touch-ups, I feel like they are pretty much enough. The next step would be to go ahead and start adding the little crumbles as a particle system or a mesh node all over the surface of our ice cream, so as to, you know, decorate this with little sprinkles or whatever you want. So for the purpose of making the sprinkles, we're going to be making a real simple mesh, which is going to look like a capsule of sorts, which doesn't need to have a high amount of detail considering how it's going to be so small. So I will be generating a bunch of small capsules, for example with 20 vertices with the cylinder is good enough for me. I will be rotating this, I think. We will see later. Let's just first model them. And we got these shapes right here, and we're going to be making like a small capsules going on like that. For example, this is one. It's good enough. Shade smooth. You gotta realize that this is going to be small tiny details, so it won't be easy to see. And you want to have a bunch of this, like a bunch of small different shape thingies that you can customize however you want. And with these shapes, I think it's enough. Now we can move our star to a side, and all of these objects right here, let's move them to another side, and we're going to generate a new collection. And we're going to be adding all of these things to this collection right here, which we might call the sprinkles, for example, right? And what we want to do here now is apply on top of this ice cream mesh right here the modifier to add all of these sprinkles right here. So how do we add these sprinkles with particle system? Well, what you have to do is go ahead and look for the particle system tab, or add a modifier of particle system, right? But how do we do that here? Well, the first thing to prevent any errors is to grab our spiral, because if you realize this is currently a curve, we're gonna make a copy. We're going to hide the original. I'm gonna keep the copy just in case. We're gonna convert to mesh, and we're going to go ahead and add the modifiers that we had before, and now it looks exactly the way that we intended to. With this thing right now, we can go ahead and look at this symbol right here, which is the particle stuff. We're gonna add a new particle system of type hair. Now the problem is that we want to render a bunch of sprinkles on top of our ice cream, not a bunch of hairs. And to be able to use our hair emitter, because we want the properties of the hair emitter to use for our purposes of displaying a bunch of sprinkles, we're gonna have to activate the advanced settings, which will allow us to change the way that we render these hairs in different ways. One of which will be the rotation according to multiple settings that we will be using later, and we can change the render settings, and instead of rendering as a path, we can render as a object, which will allow us to select a single object. That means we only have one mesh for the sprinkles, or we can select collection, and we select collection, it allows us to instantiate multiple different objects that are within a certain collection all over the surface of this object. Now we have this, and there is nothing going on because we still have to select the collection that we want to use, and our collection, as we named it before, is sprinkles. So we'll select the sprinkles collection, and you can see that it is working, kinda. We don't want that many sprinkles, or maybe we do, we just don't want these sprinkles to be gigantic. So these are one of the many things that we must change. The first thing is obviously changing the scale to a reasonable value. We're gonna be selecting a randomized rotation. We're gonna increase it. We're going to change the random phase. We're going to change the phase, random phase, and for now you might be tempted to say that this is good enough, that this is precisely how we want it to work, and you might be satisfied with this. But you can change the orientation axis of your sprinkles to, for example, the normal tangent, and you might get sprinkle results that are better for your purposes with this result if you want. You can also decrease the number of children that we have. For example, this may look like too many sprinkles for some people, so we can decrease it to 500. Let's get down to the last segment, which would be applying the materials to this object. So how do we apply these materials to make our ice cream look as good as possible, right? So the materials that I'm going to be creating are going to be pretty simple. Let's get started by saving our project, and I'm making one very simple material for the ice cream itself. First of all, let's go to the shading window, right? And let's add a new material to our ice cream. Let's not forget about that. And now we have our principal BSDF node set up right here. Now with this setup, we can start generating a sort of wet looking material that we want to create. You might want to generate a more complex material, but this is a very simple one that you can create to get a somewhat decent look out of this, right? So the first thing that we can do is look for a texture coordinate node, because we have not unwrapped our mesh, and even if we did, if we wanted to bake, we would want to have proper texture coordinates when performing any sort of rendering. So we're going to pick up our texture coordinates, and we're going to take the coordinates of our object, so it will automatically perform a sort of quote-unquote unwrapping for us to make the textures that we're going to apply look better. Now you can use any textures you want, but you can generate a noise texture node, which I usually configure on, by connecting the object to vector and having this be on 3D noise. Though, depending on where you are, you might want to lower the amount of dimensions for your noise so that the performance and render speed is increased. You can play around with the scale and properties. We will see this in a while. Let's keep this as it is right now, and we'll change it in a while. And what we want to do is go ahead and say, for example, a color ramp. There we go. Now the purpose of this color ramp might not seem to make much sense, but it is going to let us determine how let's say, shiny or wet looking the ice cream is going to be. So you can play around with these parameters. This will change the noisiness of the material that we're going to generate in the end, and this can help us determine how the glossiness looks in this noise material. So the darker parts and the lighter parts will have a different glossiness. And how do we achieve this sort of wet glossiness effect is by putting this result here into the roughness. And of course we're gonna get errors with that, so we need to pass this RGB result to black and white. So we're gonna get to RGB all the way to black and white and connect this into roughness, and now we got the roughness map properly generated, which, as you can see right here, it's already taking effect. So before we continue, one thing that we might want to do is go ahead and make a color RGB color attribute, maybe. No, I don't remember. I've been a while without using input RGB. There we go. And we're gonna be putting this into the base color, right? And this will allow us to determine what color we want our ice cream to be. So for example, let's say I want to make a sort of, you know, chocolate ice cream, and it's already looking pretty nice, but this is real low resolution, so we want to change the scale of our noise. Now, the bigger the scale, the more detail this is going to have, as you can clearly see right here. Obviously, this depends on how close you're going to be to this ice cream when you're looking at it. You might want to give it more or less detail. If I recall correctly, on the render that I showed you at the beginning, I use a detail scale of 10. Now that the material for this object right here is completely ready, we can begin applying similar materials to all of the objects that will be helping us decorate the ice cream, such as the sprinkles. Now that we have finished applying these materials to these objects, we have finally a set of colorful little sprinkles that will be populating all over the top of our ice cream. Now the final step left remaining would be to apply the material for the cone of our ice cream. And this material that we're going to be applying is going to be using mainly, well, we're going to be using the texture coordinate again, and we're going to be using a lot of noise textures right here. Well, a lot, one or two of them we're going to be using. The scale might vary, it depends on what exactly you want, but for the most part I believe a pretty standard setup might be good enough. Obviously you want to customize these settings as much as possible to your liking. Again, we're going to be using the noise map with a color ramp so that the dark parts will be bound to a certain color and the lighter parts to a different one. So in the case of our other materials, we were using that for the roughness, so we would be using the dark parts to generate a black side or grayish part of the image in our noise map that we will be using for the roughness map. In the case of this color ramp right here, in this material, we want to interpolate between two different colors because we're going to be generating the cookie, and the colors that I'm going to be using are mostly going to be somewhat darkish cookie colors like brownish, and going all the way to a lighter tone on the other end of the cookie material. Not too good at picking colors, sorry about that, but I'm doing my best. So something like that along those lines would be pretty good. You would have to play around by adjusting these materials to select a far better tone mapping, because it feels like this one is like too cartoony, I guess. I think this would look somewhat more realistic, but it doesn't matter much. It's about you, how you up to you how to customize this as much as possible. Now this, as you can see, generates a pretty simple map where we got the colors, which you know, you might want to increase the amount of detail that we have in this map right here. But first we're going to be noting that this is only for the color, so that doesn't matter much yet, because the bulk of our detail is going to be coming from a bump node that we're going to be using, connecting it to the normal input of the BSDF principle. The settings for this depend on how much bumpiness you want, but usually you want to tone down the bumpiness, because by default it's going to be real strong. 0.2, 0.3, 0.25, something like that. I'm gonna leave it at 1 first, and I'll see how much it looks like now. So we're going to generate another noise texture, and remember how I mentioned that this one is simply for generating a very simple map to select the colors, and that the bulk of the detail will be coming from this setup down here. Well, this noise node right here, which we're going to be connecting to the height, by the way, of our bump map, is going to generate the bulk of the detail. So as you can see, it's already looking kind of like a low detail texture for the cookie. Since this is going to be generating the bulk of the detail, what we want to do is increase the size to something like 30. Well, maybe that's too much, maybe 20, 50, it's maybe, you know, a 40. I'm gonna leave it at 35, I think. And the amount of detail can change according to however you want. Don't leave it at 0, obviously, it doesn't look like a cookie. Increasing it more can make it look like a stone if you get up close, but this is pretty good amount of detail, I suppose. And as for the roughness, the default parameter I think is enough. Increasing it and decreasing it doesn't really help much. And we're not going to be adding any distortion, because this is a rough crusty material. This one right here is more like cream, so the distortion in the noise map gives a good effect, but the distortion here is going to look weird. It's like this is wood or a brain-like substance, and that's not how the ice cream cone looks like. Now what we're going to be doing now is going to be using a mapping function of sorts, which we can utilize to generate a set of points that we can use from the object coordinates as an input vector right here. With this function right here, which I don't want my computer to crash when using it, we can now generate a cookie-like looking material of sorts, which, if you look at the difference by unplugging this piece, you can see that this is like a pretty big chunky stuff, and when we make it smaller we get a little bit more of detail. Now you can reduce the amount of noise, the scale, whatever. I'm gonna set it, for example, at 10 and see how it looks. Or you could set it at 20, whatever you want, right? And now the next step is grabbing this material, is grabbing this material, copying it, and we're going to be applying it to this part right here as well. Now you might be looking at this and saying, bro, this looks like shit. Well, yes, but we're going to be fixing that, because we're looking at it in the flat shaded viewport, and we want to enter cycles so that we can render a good looking scene. We're going to be generating a camera, and now that we got this camera right here, we want to position it in a way such that we can look at the scene and more or less, you know, have a good angle. And there we go, we got our ice cream dead center. And what we're going to be doing now is generate a very simple background, which can be made simply by generating a very large plane. In here we select the plane that we generated, we're gonna make it bigger. I'm going to disable this thing, right? And now what you can do is, at this point right here, generate a sort of wall looking thing for your background and making it somewhat smooth, right? I'm gonna shade smooth this thing, and this helps us generating a pretty simple background that we're going to be using for the light reflections of cycles. Alright, so the final step truly right now is adding the lighting that you will need for your scene. So if we go into the render mode, we can see how our scene will look once it's getting rendered, and we can go ahead and apply a light, and we can generate a sunlight and orient it in such a way that it lights your ice cream however you want it to be lit. Before we start rendering, you're going to see that the render engine is Eevee, and there's nothing wrong with Eevee, but Eevee does not give us good results as Cycles, because Cycles makes use of path tracing to generate a lighting that is far more realistic. So in this tutorial I'll be using Cycles. You don't have to, you're free to use whatever you want. But when you are using Cycles, one thing that you might want to have into account is not to render on the CPU. You will want to render on the GPU compute. You will probably not, if you haven't done this before, you might not be able to select GPU compute. For that you have to go into preferences, and if I recall correctly, there is an option somewhere here. I don't remember exactly in which window it was. In system, there we go. Now you gotta be careful when selecting this option. You gotta look up, obviously you need to know what your graphics card is. There we go, we got the GPU rendering tab on the Blender manual. This part right here explains which settings you must select depending on your graphics card. So after that we got the GPU compute enable, and now you can tweak all of your render settings however you want, just to make sure that you can get as much resolution out of these images, as many samples as possible, the best denoising capabilities. And obviously one of the things that you need to change is the output properties. Now right here we got this image with a render resolution that is exactly the one on my screen. One thing that you might want to do is double the render resolution, or get a real large render resolution, or change it to whatever. I'm going to be using the double of my own screen render resolution just for the sake of generating a larger image, right? And now that this is done, the final step before finally rendering our scene is to go ahead and press the little camera icon that is right next to the I button that we press to hide our objects in the scene, so that these objects that we hid before will not appear in our render, because even if you make an object to be invisible in your scene, it can still appear on your render unless you disable it. Finally, all that is left to do is to go ahead and press the render button and begin rendering our image. Now this process is going to take quite a while, even if you're using GPU compute. If you're not using that and you're on CPU using Cycles, you're truly going to take a real long time. And now what we will be doing is making a cut so that you don't have to sit through all the rendering process, and I will come back once it has finished and show you the results. Alright, so this right here is the final render that we have achieved after this much work. And well, as you can see, it's a somewhat decent render. You can tune these things as much as you want, and we can go ahead and save this render. So the way we do it is by going to image, save as, and you will go ahead and generate the output render. So I will call this tutorial render, and we want to store this as whatever image format you want. I personally choose for Blender output the OpenEXR RGB full to prevent losing any sort of data, you know, to get as much detail out of as possible. And we will just simply save the image, and there we go. And this is the end of the tutorial. Thank you very much for watching my video. Hopefully this was a real helpful tutorial for you, and you were capable of obtaining any sort of helpful information out of this. If you have any recommendations for future videos, I am willing to listen, and see you in the next one. Goodbye.